After the Cold War, the focus of global safety moved away from invading armies and toward borderless, transnational threats. The 1997 Asian financial crisis proved that economic contagion could bypass state sovereignty entirely, devastating populations from the inside out. Sudden epidemiological outbreaks, like SARS, hitched rides on civilian travel networks, exposing the vulnerability of local health systems to global pathogens. And natural catastrophes inflicted mass casualties on a scale that rendered traditional military defenses completely useless. This shift created a new framework called human security. Analysts began measuring safety by the individual's freedom from fear and want, rather than the defense of a geographic border. By the turn of the century, these structural and transnational risks highlighted the limitations of traditional state-on-state military frameworks when faced with borderless crises. That progress abruptly stalled on September 11, 2001. A single shock event triggered a massive global regression in how governments approached security. Rather than treating the attacks as a borderless criminal conspiracy, executives framed them as a traditional military threat to the survival of the state itself. This is securitization, the mechanism leaders use to bypass democratic constraints. It begins with a speech act, declaring an issue an existential threat demanding unquestioned action. Once accepted, it justifies mobilizing extraordinary resources and suspending civil liberties. Under the banner of safety, democracies began enacting surveillance and detention policies that mirrored the tactics of authoritarian regimes. In the pursuit of absolute state security, unchecked executive power can paradoxically degrade the actual human security of the population it claims to protect. The doctrine of total fear emerged as a new organizing principle for the state, replacing the Cold War logic of total war. This new logic lumped every localized conflict, secessionist movement, and regional bombing into one monolithic global threat. Localized attacks like the 1998 embassy bombings in East Africa were absorbed into this broader narrative of an omnipresent enemy. Following the 2002 Bali bombings, this doctrine prompted immediate and reactionary legislative changes across multiple continents. A state of perpetual emergency inherently centralizes authority. It pushes the executive branch to operate outside traditional legal boundaries, claiming that normal laws are insufficient for current risks. When the executive branch claims a monopoly on security through total fear, the judiciary remains the only structural bulwark left to protect civil society. High Court of Australia Justice Michael Kirby has highlighted how domestic courts act as the primary defense mechanism against this executive overreach. The core tool they use is the legal concept of proportionality. This principle requires that state security measures must not inflict more harm on a civil society than the threat they aim to prevent. In 2001, the Constitutional Court of South Africa applied this in Mohammed v. President, blocking the executive from unlawfully deporting a terrorism suspect without human rights guarantees. Similarly, in 2004, the Indonesian Constitutional Court rejected the executive's attempt to prosecute Bali bombing suspects using retroactive terrorism laws. That same year, the Israeli Supreme Court delivered a landmark ruling on the state's security fence. The court determined that the physical routing of the wall through specific lands caused a disproportionate injury to civilians when weighed against the security it provided the state. These rulings from diverse legal systems reflect a shared understanding. Security measures must stay within the bounds of proportionality to retain their legitimacy. The most extreme manifestation of securitization is the attempt to create legal black holes, territories immune to judicial oversight. Regarding detainees at Guantanamo Bay, the United States executive branch argued that non-citizens held outside sovereign territory had no right to habeas corpus. The Supreme Court pushed back in Rasool v. Bush, asserting that the rule of law restrains the executive regardless of territorial technicalities. A parallel overreach occurred in the United Kingdom under the Anti-Terrorism, Crime and Security Act of 2001. The British government instituted a policy of indefinitely detaining non-national terrorist suspects without formal charges, based purely on ministerial suspicion. This policy was eventually challenged before the British House of Lords in the case of A v. Secretary of State. The law lords ruled that holding non-nationals indefinitely without trial was a wholly disproportionate measure that violated fundamental human rights protections. The highest courts in both the US and the UK established that executive emergency powers cannot permanently erase the structural checks of a functioning democracy. Reverting to national security fails because it relies on an outdated international worldview. Governance added a transnational layer of corporations and NGOs, but this leans heavily on Euro-American models. Scholar Yasuaki Onuma proposes a transcivilisational perspective, arguing human identity cannot be mapped by borders alone. Populations hold multi-layered identities. A person functions within a state and participates in global markets, while adhering to deep cultural structures that transcend geography. Policies crafted without recognizing these overlapping identities rely on simplistic binaries that breed resentment and fuel the very transnational threats they aim to stop. Genuine global governance requires moving beyond the state-centric model to embrace the complex, transcivilisational reality of human identity. The post-9/11 era attempted to trade human security for state security, driven by a manufactured climate of total fear. But this trade-off is often self-defeating. Degrading civil liberties does not produce a safer state. It produces a weaker, less legitimate one. The courts, utilizing the doctrine of proportionality, remain the vital last line of defense against the legal black holes created by executive securitization. Moving forward, global civil society cannot be managed through a top-down, purely Western approach. Achieving genuine stability requires a rejection of fear-based politics in favor of governance built on the transcivilisational security of the person. Ultimately, the security of the human being is the foundational requirement for the security of the nation.